Yeah, so before I start, I'm just going to do a quick recap of what we just went through today, right? So in the morning we did leadership styles. So we were exposed to 4 different kinds of leadership styles, right? So we talk very in depth on autocratic leadership, democratic leadership, laissez-faire leadership, servant leadership, and we just went through a very long lecture on team building and conflict management. And I think it's very appropriate that the last question that was asked was, how do you use these leadership styles, or how do you use this knowledge that we learn? And team building and conflict management, if you think about it, it's a process. Okay, it's a process that we have to go through every single time we have a team. And what Anthony just mentioned in the past 5 minutes, that team building can come in any kind of scenario. So constantly throughout the lecture, he has been mentioning NCOship, but it's beyond NCOship, right? It's like, for example, you are in class and you're doing a group project, okay? You will go through this process of team building with your newly formed group, giving a history, a presentation, or whatever it is. And a lot of this, including whatever we have just been through in conflict management, requires someone in the team to facilitate the process. Okay, a lot of this requires someone to facilitate the process, and that is the value of what we have been terming so far a leader. Okay, technically speaking, we put the soft skills aside, we put character aside. Technically speaking, the role of a leader in the team is basically to facilitate this process of team building, of conflict management, and these were built on whatever we have just learned this morning on understanding how people interact, understanding how can you interact with people based on different leadership styles. Okay, so my lecture that I'm going to cover now will basically talk about the technical skills of facilitation, but it'll be very centered on the idea of debriefing. Okay, I say again, I'll be talking about the whole concept of facilitation, but it'll be very centered on the idea of debriefing. So what is facilitation? I just mentioned the team management aspect, things like this, but there's a lot more facilitation that we go through in day-to-day life. For example, when you go and have a game of sports, you are actually facilitating a game. Okay, there are some rules, you need someone to enforce the rules, things like this. So a game master, a station master is a facilitator. Okay, in St. John, after each lesson, after a first aid lesson, after a foot drill lesson, there's a lesson debrief. And through the debrief, now as NCOs, I'm sure that you do debriefs with your cadets. That is a process that requires facilitation. When we are NCOs or when we are leaders and we point out mistakes of others, for example, we go to training and then you realize that cadet is late for training. You want to find out why. Why is this person late? What is the reason for being late? And then you want to imprint the idea that being late is wrong and you should be as far as possible punctual. That in itself is a process of facilitation. So this is what we are going to go through, but as I said, with debriefing as the main example that I'll be giving. Okay, so at any point in time, as I've always said, if you think that I'm going too fast, use the participants button, the go faster, go slower button, and prompt me so that I know whether I can change my speed. Okay, I actually have a couple of activities that I want to go through. I'll cut some of them, and as usual, we'll get some of you to share. And when I do, I hope that you can draw upon your own experiences. It need not be St. John because, like I said, this is basically something that happens everywhere and anytime. Okay. So these are the module objectives. First, I will go through very briefly using debrief, a short introduction on debriefs. Okay, so understanding what are debriefs. All right, why is it important? Okay, and I will do this by introducing to you something known as the experiential learning cycle. So today in team management, we learn about Tuckman's 5 stages of development. Okay, today I'm going to introduce you another thing called the experiential learning cycle. And this plays a very important part in explaining why is it important to debrief and also what is the role of a facilitator. Okay, so I'm going to then dive in my third section, I'm going to dive into what does a facilitator do and how do you be a facilitator. Okay, so briefly, this is what I'm going to go through. So let's start with the basics. Debriefing. What is the debrief and why is it important? So essentially, when we are debriefing someone, the examples I just gave you, a lesson debrief, a debrief on someone's lateness, a debrief on someone's improper attire, all these are basically trying to structure learning for someone, trying to review someone's experience so that they learn something out of it. That is what we are trying to achieve during a debrief, and that is what a debrief is. Okay? When we are doing this, the most important thing is we want to explore why these things happen. So why are you late? Why are you in an improper attire? Why do you learn this? And very importantly, once we know the why, then we can think about what's next. How can we improve things? How can you not be late? How can you make sure the next time you are properly attired? How can you prepare yourself for future scenarios where this may happen? Okay, so each debrief is basically benefiting you in the future, and that is why it's important. Okay, up to now, can follow, right? Can follow, just give me a nod. Okay, great. So when we do this, it's basically identifying the strengths and weaknesses of individuals and teams. So moving forward, we can identify the different opportunities that we can bank on to improve. Very simple. And I've given you many examples of when do we conduct debriefs, and these are just some very basic examples. Project management. So for example, the coursework that you guys are working on now, very simply, after today's session, you can do a debrief amongst yourselves and wonder at which stage of project development are you at, and what has been going well thus far, what has not been going well thus far. And I hope that as I'm saying these questions, you actually notice that this is part of the after action review that has been taught to you in program planning. So the AAR in program planning is also a debrief, right? And today we are going to go through some of the skills that can help you conduct AARs. So that's one aspect of debriefing. Another aspect of debriefing is after any activities. So like what I just said, lessons, games, events are also events and different scenarios are also considered activities. So like I said, it can be about reporting, things like that. It can be about after a first aid test and stuff like this. Okay. So now we understand. Now we have gone through three big things. Okay. So what debriefs are? Why are debriefs important? And when do we do debriefs? So now I'm going to tell you more about the why of debriefs. And this is very related to the experiential learning cycle. So don't be too caught up with what this experiential learning cycle is. You can see on the screen on the right side, I have these 4 complicated blocks. But basically, if I simplify this for you, I can simplify this for you into these few simple questions. All right. So I want to know whenever something happened, I want to know what happened. Okay. By asking what happened, I know basically the event. It can be someone failed a first aid test, for example. All right. The next step number 2. Okay. Step number 2 asks, so what and why? So what is the implication of you failing a first aid test? Why did you fail the first aid test? Okay. And the reverse can be true. We can debrief a good thing. So someone aced the first aid test, got full marks. So what is the implication? Why? How do you ace the first aid test? Then we ask about, so now that we know these good things and then now we know these bad things, what do we do about it? And then finally we just go and do it lah. So once you do it, it's another action and then it repeats itself. So now we go back to the whole idea of the event happening. We ask what happened and we review. So this is how we learn in general. So every day, day to day, this is how you learn. Okay. So very quickly, if you look at these 4 stages over here, which of these stages do you think debriefing comes in? So if I'm telling you that today after a first aid test, we're going to have a short debrief. Okay, as a facilitator, as an NCO, if you look at your cadets that have just gone through an activity or gone through a first aid test or whatever test, what do you think is your job as an NCO in terms of these 4 things over here? 5 seconds to think about it. Okay, time's up. Okay, can we get let's see, Zhijie, are you there? Sorry, wait, I can't hear you. Maybe there's something wrong with my.
Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, I can hear you now. Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Zhijie.
So I think that debriefing will be involving first step, the first to the third step.
First to the third step. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. How about, okay, find someone that never on the webcam. How about, how come I cannot see my here? How about Jiale from Kranji? Are you there?
Yes.
Hi, Jiale. So, do you agree with what Zhijie just said?
Yes.
So, which are the steps that you think debriefing supports?
Because I think it's now what?
Now what? So only step 3?
No, but the entire process until now what?
Oh, until now what? Okay, good. So yes, thank you, Jiale, and thank you, Zhijie. So that's correct. So debriefing covers 3 out of the 4 steps, right? So basically, if you think about it, as a facilitator, your job is to ask questions to prompt these 3 steps of learning. And that is what a debrief is about. Asking the correct questions to your participants so that you can prompt these 3 steps of learning. And then, of course, it's up to the participants to apply whatever they have learned in the 4th step, which is doing it again, applying things back in a future scenario when a similar scenario occurs. Okay, fairly simple. So now we understand what debriefs are. Like I said, this is a very debrief-centered lecture, which I don't think is bad, but just bear in mind, now I'm going to go through the role of facilitator. As I'm going through this, think about what are the external scenarios that can come into the steps that I'm going to go through. How can we fit this general model somewhere else? And we will talk about this at the end of the lecture. So essentially, what is a facilitator? A facilitator, in some sense, is a leader of a team, right? You can think of what we just went through with Tony's first lecture. A facilitator is a leader of a team, right? And it's just that now you're taking a very active role as a facilitator, as a leader. You're going to guide people through by asking questions. That's just what I told you about the debriefing learning cycle. So we clarify the objectives of a debrief. We clarify the objectives of what we want to facilitate, and we ask them the relevant questions. That's point number 1. Number 2 is, so very, very clearly speaking, as a leader that does this, you need to ensure that this learning environment that everyone is conducive and inclusive. Okay, and I'll talk more about this learning environment later on. We're talking about both a physical environment and both more of a team environment where learning and feedback is welcome. And finally, in order to facilitate step 4, which is the do it step, we will make sure that everything that we go through during a debrief is properly recorded so that everyone knows lah. So the learning is not done for nothing. Okay, so over here, just a summary, three very simple points on what is the role of a facilitator. Now we know what's the role. Let's talk about how do you be one, okay? And over here, I've come up with this model, all right? Step number 1 is preparation work, okay? Before anything, you need to prepare. It's like going for an exam. Before you go for an exam, you go and study. If you don't study, you don't know what you're going to do, you're going to screw it up, right? So there must be some preparation work that needs to be done. Then we go into a cycle, okay? Why I say we go into a cycle? Because in one debriefing session, we can go through these 4 subsequent steps a few times. All right? It's not step 1, the first 10 minutes we clarify objectives, next 20 minutes we do step 2 and 3 and 4. No, it can be constantly going back to step 1, constantly thinking about whether step 2 exists, constantly going through step 3 again and again even, and constantly revisiting step 4, okay? Which is why these 4 steps are basically in a cycle. And we will look at each of these 5 different steps one by one in the few slides to come. Okay, so let's talk about preparation first. So I'll think that there are 2 main big aspects to preparing. Okay, number 1, we need to prepare ourselves. Like I said, if you go to an exam without studying, you will fail. Okay, so what does preparing yourself mean? It means understanding what you are going to debrief. Okay, debriefing is not something whereby you just walk into the room and you say, okay, I'm going to be a facilitator of a debrief. It doesn't work this way. If you don't know what happened, if you don't know what is going on, it's very difficult for you to be a value-adding facilitator. Okay, so how do you go and understand? How do you go and prepare? Okay, one way is to observe the activities and know what are some of the significant events, what are some of the notable events that can become potential debrief pointers. Okay, and in this sense, what I mean is this: if you're going to debrief a first aid lesson, then based on common sense, you should be the one delivering the first aid lesson. You don't go and debrief a first aid lesson that you have neither observed nor were the one conducting. Okay, because you don't know what just happened in the first aid lesson, right? So that's what I mean by you need to be there to observe if you're not the one conducting. Okay, and very importantly, you must go and recap the facilitation process. You must know, hey, later I'm going to do this. I need to clarify the objectives. Because imagine you go inside a debrief and you forget what you need to do. Then you're just fluffing, right? You're just sitting down there wasting everyone's time. And that's the last thing you want to do because there's no learning value. It defeats the whole idea of having a debrief. So that is your own self-preparation, preparing to go for the exam. The next thing is you need to prepare your participants, okay? Prepare them for the exam. So obviously you need to set a location at the time. Certain times, these things come naturally. After a lesson, naturally you have a debrief. It's allocated, fair, okay? But certain times, for example, the example that I gave just now, project management. While we are planning a project, sometimes we can cater for meetings, okay? And when we cater for meetings, some of these meetings can be catered for to review what we have done thus far, all right? And therefore, it's important that we set the appropriate location and time for the debrief. Very commonsensical. Next thing, like I said in my previous slide, it's about creating this conducive environment to learn, okay? So setting appropriate time and location is the physical environment part. Communicating the debrief is not a fault-finding process. That is creating the conducive environment that we want for everyone to learn. So it means that when you go into a debrief, it's not about saying that, hey, you did this, I don't like it. It's not about saying that, hey, you sucked, you didn't do your job. Okay, it's not a fault-finding process. Okay, what we are trying to do is not identify what's wrong. We are trying to identify what's wrong and why is it wrong. How can we improve? That's very important to bear in mind, and it's not sufficient for you as a facilitator to remember. It's very important that all your participants remember this, because trust me, and I'm sure you can relate, that as long as someone starts pointing fingers, everyone will start pointing fingers. If someone points finger at you, then you will be like, hey, why this guy point finger at me? Then I'll go and point finger back at him. Or I'll point fingers at someone else to create a distraction from me, right? So that's where conflict happens, and that's where unhappiness grows. So that's something that we definitely want to avoid during a debrief. So right at the get-go, we need to communicate that a debrief is not a fault-finding process. Okay, so now we are at the debrief, right? Now we are ready. First thing to do is clarify the debrief objective. Okay, why do we need to clarify the debrief objective? This is very easy when we're talking about activity-based debriefs. Okay, this is very relevant for project management. All right, imagine, for example, some of you are doing your projects, correct? When I say clarify the debrief objective, then we want to know what exactly are we going through today? What is the scope? Is it to review the past 2 weeks that we have been working on something? Or maybe in your case, is it the past, since the last meeting, there have been some tasks that have been delegated to everyone, and now we are going to review this stuff, just like an AAR. It's very important to list the scope. If not, I can talk about things that happened about a month back, right? Something that is long lasting. All right. So another part about clarifying the objectives is that it must be relevant. Okay. Sometimes we want to be very focused on certain matters. All right. So let me give you an example. Imagine you are having CCA, okay? And towards the end of CCA, as an NCO, you say, okay, let's go and play soccer. So the whole core goes and plays soccer, all right? So imagine if we're going to debrief a soccer game in St. John. Okay, imagine we're going to debrief a soccer game in St. John, or it can be any sport. We play captain's ball. We're going to debrief a captain game in St. John. After everything, after half an hour of playing, you as an NCO come, okay, say we want to clarify the objectives. So what do you think is the focus of the debrief? As an NCO, what do you think is the objective of the debrief? Would it be relevant if we debrief about tactics, about like, hey, why just now you don't run forward a bit, create more space? Hey, why just now you never go and do this? Why just now you could have jumped but you never jump? Why just now you can pass but you never pass? Things like this. Okay, if you pass over the person A, the person A pass over the person B, then the person C run forward, then after that catch the ball or score already. Do you think the debrief should focus on tactics, or do you think the debrief should focus more about individual behavior or team dynamics? More like, oh, why just now you don't want to pass the ball and you want to hog the ball? Why just now you push your friend? Why did you decide to shout at someone just now? So that's what I'm trying to say, is that an activity has many debrief pointers, and it's not very obvious to people what are the objectives of a debrief, what are the objectives they're trying to achieve when you're doing a debrief. So it's very important at the get-go, we need to clarify what is the focus for today. And it's the role of a facilitator to make sure that all these things are done right from the start. Okay, another example would be like, you can be having a project meeting, a presentation meeting with your classmates, right? And then someone comes up with an irrelevant topic. Okay, so for example, you can be in the same group. Okay, you can be in the same history presentation group, or same chemistry presentation group. This meeting is supposed to be for history. Someone starts talking about chemistry. So it's very important, set the stage right as a facilitator, clarify the objectives. Once we clarify the objectives, then we need to do something like what presentation skills has taught you. We need to do audience analysis. Okay, you need to know who are you facilitating. And once we know who are we facilitating, sometimes it might be useful that we adopt some debriefing tools. Debriefing tools are just like activities that facilitate discussion. Okay, for example, what we have been doing thus far in this course. Sometimes we use Padlet, sometimes we use Mentimeter, sometimes we just use the chat, sometimes we just get you to unmute yourselves and talk, okay? So debriefing tools basically just help you engage your participants a little bit more, and whatever is being shared in this slide is non-exhaustive, okay? So tools have different objectives, all right? Very relevant to us, it can be to break the ice in new teams, to break the ice in your shy cadets. But at the same time, tools are also important because a lot of these tools are basically structures and systems to make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak and everyone gets a chance to share their views, so that individuals don't dominate the discussion. So in this slide, I'm going to show you two very simple tools that you can use. But these are not, like I said, limited. Okay, you can go and read this up. It's basically think, pair, share. Basically, you just pair up and share, and then get one or two friends to share, right? So it's like a group work. Then each group discuss. Then get one or two groups to share. It's the same concept. Draw your thoughts. Draw your thoughts is basically just draw. You draw what you feel, and then someone can. So there's a basis for you to talk about. Instead of talking from nothing, you at least you allow them to have a very deliberate process of reflecting. Okay, so I'm going to skip through this slide because, like I said, you can think and innovate whatever kind of tools you want to use as long as it fits your audience type. Okay. up till now, are there any questions? No? Okay, thank you. Now, this is the meat. This is the meat of your 4 steps. Okay, 3-step questionings. Okay, 3-step questioning. So, like I said, during a debrief, your role as a facilitator is to ask sensible questions to your participants. So what? So that they can learn. Okay, and like I said, 3-step questioning can happen multiple times. So it's not as simple as you ask 3 questions, that's the end of the debrief, right? Commonsensical. So it's for every single event that we highlight during a debrief, we will employ 3-step questioning. Every time we surface something, what happened? Once we ask what happened, then we will need to go to the so what, the why, and the now what. Then we will go back to the what happened. That's the second thing that we're going to talk about. Then we will go on to the so what, the why, and the now what. Okay. And as you ask these questions, this is where the debriefing tool that you ask, that you chose, can be used. So you can use think, pair, share. Once you ask a question, group them up into pairs, think about it, talk to each other, then get people to share about their ideas. Okay. And very importantly, when we ask questions, okay, when we ask an open-ended question, for example, people can answer you irrelevant stuff. So it is your job as a facilitator to bear in mind when the answers to the questions are going off track. And going off track doesn't mean it's bad, okay? Going off track can be exploring a totally new thing, for example, okay? But it's your job as a facilitator to say, okay, we acknowledge that this is an important thing to go through. Let's talk about it later, but let's focus back on the idea at hand. So for example, I use back the example of playing a captain's ball game, okay? So maybe there was a scenario that happened, right? The idea that somebody was unwilling to pass the ball to another player, okay? We asked, why do you do so? All right. And then this person said that, okay, so for person A said that person B shouted at him just now and therefore he was unwilling to pass the ball back to person B. Okay. So now person A brought up a separate what happened event, which is person B shouted at person A. So it's important to address that person B shouted at person A. But now that we are in this cycle, addressing the act and the idea that person A did not pass the ball, then we should focus on this first. So remember that as a facilitator, your role is to ensure that the discussion remains on track and focus on the actions of person A. Once we settle that, then we can talk about what person B did. Okay? So let's talk about how do we ask these questions, okay? So what are questions that can help you? So what are the purpose of what happened questions? What are the purpose of so what, why questions? What's the purpose of now what questions? So firstly, what happened? What happened is basically just fact finding. You're just find out what actually happened now, as it suggests. So it's basically recalling the experience of the activity and the process. So you ask people, what do you observe? What happened just now? What went well just now? And this will allow people to surface, oh, just now we passed the ball very well. Just now someone didn't pass the ball to me. Just now during the first aid lesson, it was too fast. Just now during the theory test was too difficult for me, okay? When we understand on the surface things that had happened, then we want to ask, what are the implications of this? What does it mean that these things happen? And we want to know, why do these things happen? So the next type of questions we're going to ask, the so what and why questions, are also termed feeling finding questions. Okay? Things happen for a reason, all right? Behavior is driven by someone's opinion, someone's feelings, their values, and their beliefs, which is why the so what and why questions are feeling finding questions. We want to know what is the underlying cause of this kind of behavior. Okay, so for example, let's talk about the ball passing scenario. Okay, so what happened is person A did not want to pass the ball to person B. The so what and why question will be, so if you ask person A now, so how did you feel when you decided not to pass the ball to person B? Did it make you, so the response that we want to get is like, they make him happier? Do you feel more satisfied? And why is this so? Is it because you have this revengeful mindset? Is it because you are unhappy with person B? So these are the things that we want to find out. What is driving the behavior? And once we can identify the behavior, that's where our job as a facilitator comes in, to help them understand and help them think about what's next to improve on. And that's when we ask the now what questions. So when person A did not want to pass the ball to person B, what are the implications of not passing the ball? Does it mean that your team does not score, right? And if your team does not score, and if person A had passed the ball to person B and the team had scored, the team may have won, right? So these are the learning points, and we want person A to derive the learning points on his own or her own, right? So understanding the implications of someone's lesson of someone's behavior can help them learn and improve in the future. So we can ask person A, in the future, how do you think you can do better? Can you set, and we were expecting a response to be like, or person A will say, I will set these personal feelings aside and focus on what the team needs to achieve. Okay, so passing the ball is a very, very simplified example. There are many other relevant scenarios that can be put in place. But this is basically the structure that we're looking for. What happened, so what and why, and finally, now what? How can we improve for the future? Okay. So any questions about this 3-step questioning process? No? Okay. So now we know that there's this 3-step questioning process. I just want to highlight some key issues about questioning and some considerations that you want to bear in mind when we are asking questions. It's not that simple, I would say. When we ask questions, number one, we tend to get very ambiguous words and answers from people. So when I can ask, how do you find the first aid lesson? And then the cadet can reply me, oh, sir, I found it very interesting, right? What does interesting mean? When we ask cadets, how do they find the first aid lesson? What is your purpose of asking the cadets that? Anyone can share? As an NCO, if you're going to ask your cadet, how do you find the first aid lesson? What is the purpose of asking your cadet that?
Do you learn from the first aid lesson?
Yes, Cheng Hao, that's right. So you're going to ask, do you learn from the first aid lesson, right? But more importantly, Cheng Hao, just keep yourself unmute. More importantly, when you ask a cadet, okay, so when you ask a cadet, how do you find the first aid lesson, and you want to find out whether the cadet learned from first aid lesson, what is the feedback that you want to get as a teacher of the first aid lesson?
How do you think the first aid lesson can be improved?
Yes, how do you think the first aid lesson can be improved, right? So that's exactly what you want to know. You want to know what do you do correctly, and you want to know what do you do badly, right? So very importantly, when we are doing debriefs and we get answers like, oh, it was interesting, or I think it was very fun, or I think that was good. We want to know what exactly is interesting, what exactly is fun, what exactly is good. Okay, does good mean it's very easy to understand the lesson? Does interesting means the cadet feels very engaged during the lesson? Feels that I don't get distracted by boring stuff during the lesson? Feels that I don't feel like staring out the window? Things like this. So that is the implication, the so what. All right. And then we want to find out the how, right? And the how is, so what part of it do you find interesting? What part of it do you find meaningful? And that is how you can solicit the feedback that you want and basically apply it in the future when you are conducting lessons, when you're conducting activities. So it's very, very important that as facilitators, as NCOs, when people ask, when you ask questions and people give you your response, give you their responses, you need to be very sharp with these responses. You need to be very critical of these responses, clarifying things to the level of an actionable, something that you can do tangibly in the future. And that is your now what. Always always ask questions to the point where you confidently know now what. And now what almost always comes in the form of an action. For example, in the first aid lesson, the action is you might have a quiz. For example, in a first aid test, the action can be study hard, prepare hard. For example, in the game of Captain's Ball that I gave you, the actionable is putting the team above yourself and putting the team above your emotions. Always come down to the now what. Okay, so this is the first point of asking and getting questions, getting answers, right? The next thing that we want to do as facilitators is allow the participants to derive that answer and derive that learning point themselves. And how do we do this? We ask open-ended questions instead of questions that suggest our own opinions. Okay, so my example over here, do you think that you could have managed your time more efficiently? If I ask any one of you, do you think you could have managed your time more efficiently? Anyone will tell me, no, I think I've managed my time very efficiently. No, right? If your NCO asks you that, your teacher asks you that, you're not going to say that, right? But do you, so your response will be, yes, I think I could have done better. Okay? The response will be, yes, I think I could have done better. But do you really believe so? That's the most important thing. Okay? Do you really, does the response really, is the response really a convicted response? Okay? So what we're trying to do is we're going to ask open-ended questions like, what do you think you could have done better? And allow them to suggest by themselves what they could have done better. Okay? I'm getting some feedback, then you go faster. So I'll try and be less naggy and stop repeating myself. Okay? So these are the two big issues that I want to talk about when asking questions and getting feedback. Let's go to the last step of being a facilitator, which is recapping and summarizing learning points. So as we recall the objectives and so at the end of the debrief, we'll recall the objectives and we recall the corresponding learning points that we had. All right, so we talk about a debrief about first aid lesson. The whole objective of the debrief is to find out how much you have learned, find out how the lesson conduct was. The learning points will be, we'll go through the theory that we have covered, the practical that we have covered, and perhaps even the good things about the lessons that was covered. Okay, so we just recall them and summarize how all these learning points will help you in the future in terms of learning, in terms of conflict solving, in terms of anything. And most importantly, when we talk about how can things help you in the future, we talk about the actionables, the now what that I've been emphasizing in the past slide. All right, and all these now what's, all these actionables need to be recorded, written down somewhere, sent by a text, send an email to summarize so that people can read and always reference them. Okay, and this referencing part is very important. Remember, we talked about AAR and project management. After you do an AAR, you need to write down the things that went well, the things that went badly, so that in the future, when someone comes back and do the same project, someone comes back to plan the same St. John's Day parade, the same bonding day, then they will have a point of reference, and then they won't repeat the mistakes that you made, or they can learn from what you did well. Okay. So generally, as a facilitator, always keep things on track. Remember the objectives, guide the discussion to be focused, and very, very importantly, you need to be actively involved. You need to be actively listening. You need to be knowing what your participants are talking about, but very importantly, do not impose your personal views. Okay? it's not a case whereby you say A and everyone has to agree with you that A is correct. Okay, like for example, in terms of conflict management, if you're facilitating a conflict management scenario, okay, like Tony mentioned, or someone just now mentioned in Tony's questions, agree to disagree. Do not impose your personal views on others as a when you're given the role as a facilitator. Okay, so very quickly, I've already come to the end of my slides. I'm going to run through what we've just gone through. So what are debriefs? Firstly, debriefs are basically structured processes that we reflect and we learn what happened. Okay, and when we do this, we can improve, right? And this is part of the learning cycle. And from the learning cycle, we can know what are we going to ask during debriefs. Okay, your job as an NCO also requires you to double head as a facilitator to different debriefs in different settings, and that is your job as even a participant in your presentation group and your whatever project group that you have in your academics as well. Okay, so as a facilitator, you should set the stage for the debrief. You should guide your participants along and should record the outcomes, right? And very importantly, when you're debriefing, it's something that you need to prepare for, you need to actively participate in, and you need to keep your attention there. Okay, so that's about it. And I'm just going to leave you with this idea about go and think through what are the similarities of what we have just gone through and conflict management. So conflict management, there are some steps that Tony has brought you through, right? So step one, you need to acknowledge the conflict. Step two, you need to understand and communicate. And when we say understand and communicate, we actually list down the facts, the assumptions, and the beliefs. You need to clarify the positions of each member, right? So does that sound familiar to you? What kind of questions are that? Do you ask when you are clarifying and understanding when we understand, communicate, and we clarify these assumptions and beliefs, right? And then the step 3 of conflict management is reaching an agreement, coming back, regrouping, having a plan, things like this. So having a plan, what kind of questions do you ask to come up with a plan, right? And finally, monitoring and acknowledging. Does that correspond do you see any similarity between that and the experiential learning cycle that I went through just now? Okay, I'm not going to give you the answers to this. I think if you go and compare the slides, just by comparing the slides alone, you might be able to come up with the answers on your own. And that's all. These slides were made by me with reference to all these references. You can go and have a read if you are interested. Yeah, so that's the end of my lecture. Are there any questions? I'll be sending you the link to the quiz now. And as usual, the quiz is